think it's a big deal. I think that shorts should be.
I think they could be shorter.
As short as you want them to be.
Today, I'm going to be practicing with this podcast, Walsh World. What I like the most about this podcast is this podcast portrays 100% normal, accurate American family who talk about their normal lives. As someone who wants to speak English fluently in my daily life, this is a very good podcast. So this is why I thought to myself, Arsan, you can take advantage of this podcast and you can practice with this podcast. You can find this podcast, Walsh World, on Spotify and also on YouTube. Okay, when it comes to getting the transcripts of podcasts or YouTube videos, for instance, Walsh World, they basically publish their podcast on YouTube as well as on Spotify. Now, basically, I can get these transcripts from both Spotify and YouTube. I showed you guys many times. If you would like to get the transcripts of YouTube videos, you can directly click on this show transcripts, right? And then you will see the transcript right on the side of the screen. You can copy paste it in the Word file. Okay, this is one of the things that you can do. But the thing is, I didn't do that. Instead of doing that, many of you ask this question to me a lot. I get this question a lot. I go on this Spotify, I watch the podcast right here, and you will see this transcript section here. Instead of getting the transcripts from YouTube, I got the transcripts, I copy paste the transcript from Spotify. The reason why I did this is because the transcript in Spotify is more accurate. Like this automatically generated transcript is very accurate compared to the transcript that YouTube generates. This podcast is almost like 50 minutes long podcast. Just because this podcast is 50 minutes, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be practicing on the 50 minutes of this podcast in like a one day or in like a week. It's going to take me way longer to practice on this podcast. So for instance, I will only get like the first 25 minutes of the podcast, and I will work on this first 25 minutes of the podcast for like 4 days or for like a week maybe. So I always told you guys, you need to work on those little parts of the sources that you're practicing with. For instance, you work on this podcast, you will work on like 25 minutes of this podcast, and you will work on like the maximum like 10 minutes of the podcast per day. So for instance, I only get like 25 minutes of this podcast, okay? And that means, let's say I'm gonna be working on the 10 minutes of the podcast. In total, I will be finishing this podcast in 3 days. But just because I finish this podcast in 3 days, that doesn't mean that I will start to work on the rest of the podcast. I will work on the podcast one more time. So basically, 3 days, at the end of the 3 days, I will finish this podcast, first 25 minutes of this podcast, and the rest of the week, I will work on this podcast one more time. The reason why I'm doing that is because you need to give your brain time to process every single information properly. If you rush the process, you will not end up making the most of it. The second step is, after you copy paste the podcast in the Word file, you need to work on this podcast, you need to edit this podcast, you need to prepare your scripts. What I mean by editing is, you will listen to that podcast. I open the YouTube segment in the background, I listen to it, and I see and check if the lines perfectly match with the subtitles, with the transcripts. If there is any word or sentence that is missing, if there is any missing or extra words or sentences that shouldn't be there, I edit those parts. That takes me like 2 hours to work on this podcast, work on this transcript. Actually, editing transcript is a good way to improve your listening skill in a way. What I mean by it is, you will be 100% paying attention to their speech, the way they speak, the way they pronounce words, the way they say words, and you need to pay extra attention to the way they speak so that you can edit the transcript.
Look at you now.
Yeah, I could have been a professional
living in
Zumba
New York.
dancer.
And this is a really great way of improving your listening skill, actually, in the background. Another thing that I did in order to practice with this podcast very comfortably is that, as you can see guys here, I use color for every single character so that when they speak, I know which character says which line. So that will make it easier for me to practice with this podcast. And for instance, when Brandon speaks, when this guy speaks, I use black color. When Kennedy speaks, I use blue color. When Jen speaks, when the mother speaks, I use red color. When Dakota speaks, I use purple. That will make it so much easier and efficient for me to learn English with this podcast. I already printed out the scripts. I already printed out the sources. But the one mistake that I did, and I want you to avoid this mistake, is while you're working on the scripts on your PC, while you're editing the scripts on your PC, make sure that while you're listening to the lines of the characters, you go over those lines one by one. Make sure that you also take a note of the words that you don't know. Look up the words that you don't know in a dictionary. You can look up those words from English to your first language or English to English. It's not that important for me. For instance, I forgot to do that, and right now this is what I'm gonna be doing. I'm gonna be spending next hour checking the lines one by one and looking up the words in the dictionary, so that when I practice with this podcast, it will be so much easier for me to practice. Okay, right now I'm gonna make my coffee, and while I'm preparing my coffee, I'm gonna listen to that podcast. I'm gonna listen to the first 10 or 15 minutes of this podcast. Before I start this podcast, I would like to tell you one more thing. I get this question a lot. How many times do you watch a TV show before you actively start to practice with the scripts? How many times do you listen to the podcast before you actually get to practicing with the scripts of the podcast? You can listen to for instance, first 10 minutes of the podcast or 15 minutes of the podcast. Let's say I will work on the 10 minutes of the podcast today, and I can listen to the first 10 or 15 minutes of the podcast twice or 3 times or 4 times or just for once. The more I expose myself to their conversation is always better. But you need to make sure that you don't over listen to it again and again to a point where you get sick of it. That's the most dangerous thing.
I think that shorts should be.
I think they could be shorter.
Be a shorter.
Underwear on the next podcast.
Dakota on because we have. Oh man.
What was your near-death
experience?
Like almost hovering over me, and I'm like, what? No joke. She's like literally.
At first I thought I was like, the broken neck lady's coming after me, from Haunting of Hill House.
Bent neck lady.
Yeah, the bent neck.
At first I thought I was like, the broken neck lady's coming after me. From
It's so
Haunting
funny.
of Hill House.
I don't know if any of you guys watched The Haunting of Hill House, and there was this character, bent neck lady, in it. So this is why it was funny. By the way, it was a very good TV show. The Haunting of Hill House. I had watched it 2 times in a row. I loved it so much. Okay guys, now while I'm having my coffee, I'm gonna go over those lines one by one and see if there are any words that I don't know. And if there is, which there is, I know there are words that I don't know. I'm gonna look them up in the dictionary. I'm gonna write down the meanings of those words from English to English in case some of you might want those scripts sources from me. If any of you are interested in learning English with podcasts or interested in getting the script of those podcasts, you can DM me on Instagram.
There was one more thing that somebody said in a comment about me. And this was from Jesse's video. Somebody said that I have a zesty voice.
What's that mean?
I don't know what that means.
Zesty. I don't know what it means either, so let's see what it means. For instance, I don't know the meaning of zesty voice, so basically I'm gonna look it up.
It means.
What does it mean? It means I have a flamboyant voice.
Have a flamboyant voice.
It means they're saying that you.
Is that what it means?
Well, yeah, pretty much.
Flamboyant voice.
It means they're saying that.
Flamboyant voice, for instance, I don't know the meaning of flamboyant voice either. Flamboyant.
flamboyant voice.
It means they're
Flamboyant
saying that
voice.
Is that what it means?
Is that what it means?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay guys, it's been almost like 40 minutes, almost an hour. I'm halfway through the podcast, minute 13 almost. So far I had to look up how many words I had to look up so far. So far I had to look up 11 words, you know. I came across 11 words in the first 12 minutes of the podcast that I had never seen before, or I wasn't quite familiar with the meaning of those words. I'm gonna have to stop here because I will go on a walk. It's very cold. Thank God Christmas is coming. You know, by the time I share this, I post this video, probably it will be like mid-February or something. I listen to the same podcast. I will listen to it during my walk for like 20 minutes or 30 minutes. When I posted this video about how I learn English with podcast, I got this question, and this is a very valid question. This is a very good question actually, and I would like to talk about it for a few minutes. That's a very impressive video. Thank you so much. I want to ask you about how you can memorize what you learn and speak, because I also use podcasts to learn English. I speak it out loud, and however, it has not become a solid memory, and I forget what I learn and speak just after the day. Would you please give me some advice or recommend how to do that? Thank you so much. Now, this is a very good question. The same thing happens to me as well. Like, you know, when you practice with podcasts, you will not remember what you learned from the podcast like the day after or 2 days after, because you work on something that is very abstract, you know. There is no emotions going on, there is no different scenes, there is no pictures or emotion or actions stand out to you. Like, you only see people who sit in their chairs or couches and talk about life and talk about abstract terms. So you can expect to remember the words or the lines that you learn from podcasts. When you practice with TV shows or movies or vloggers, that's not gonna happen. That's not the case for vloggers or YouTube videos or, you know, TV shows, because there's always story going on, so you will always easily remember the words from the TV show. You will not remember the things that you learn from podcast. What you will remember when you practice with podcast is if those topics, for instance, they talk about sleep apnea, they talk about multitasking, they discuss multitasking, they talk about grinding your teeth or something like that. They talk about those topics, and if those topics ever come up, you know, when you hang out with your friends or with your girlfriends or with your family, if those topics come up during the conversation, then you can easily talk about those topics because you already thought about this topic, you already reflected on those topics, you already discussed this topic while you were practicing with this podcast. You already work on those topics, you know. You already talk about those topics. You already talk about multitasking. You already thought about it. Since you talk about those, you cover those topics while you were practicing with this podcast, if those conversations ever come up, you will be able to talk about those topics. So the only time you will remember the things from the podcast that you learn is the time where you have to talk about those topics. I am already so looking forward to spring. Okay guys, I managed to finish looking up the words in the dictionary before the dinner. So basically in only 20 minutes of this podcast, I wrote down, I had to look up in total 17 words in the dictionary. So yeah, so basically I'm done with this process. Basically I can now fully focus on just speaking English while repeating their lines without looking at the scripts. And I will start to practice with this podcast as of tomorrow, okay?